All right. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Read, share, repeat, where we discuss books from the perspective of an aspiring fantasy author. Me, Carrie Share. Joined today and as always by my cat, who cannot resist sitting on my lap when I'm trying to work. Well, today I am very excited to be bringing you another one of my Behind the Bandwagon book reviews. If you're not familiar with the concept of the series, the basic premise is that I was a voracious reader as a young child. However, as I grew older into my teen years and my 20s, other hobbies sort of took over and I wasn't reading as much. When I rejoined the scene in 2018, as you can imagine, I missed out on a lot of books, particularly in the fantasy genre, which is my favorite. And so, in an effort to familiarize with myself on some of these titles that I missed out on, I created this series, which focuses specifically on books that were very, very popular a long time ago. In order to qualify for the series, I have come up with a couple of stipulations for a book to meet. The first is that it has to be at least 5 years old, with at least a 4-star rating on Goodreads, with at least 100,000 reviews. And while that sounds strict, the idea is to focus this series on books that had a lot of hype years ago that I somehow missed out on. Hence, Behind the Bandwagon. For today's episode, I will be discussing Brandon Sanderson's debut, Elantris. At least I think it's his debut. I've heard conflicting things about that, but it's one of the very earliest books in his backlist, and I believe the first book in the Cosmere. Please correct me in the comments if you know. Released on May 30th, 2006, this book almost qualifies as a classic in the fantasy genre. And before we get into the review, first, some disclaimers. First, I know that this book was released early in Brandon Sanderson's career and may not necessarily be reflective of how he has grown as a writer in the almost 20 years since. That being said, I didn't necessarily grade on a curve. I read debuts all the time, and I don't feel like it's fair to give a debut or something earlier in someone's career more leniency just because they went on to write more books and improve. Every author would have the chance to improve if they had Brandon Sanderson's longevity. Now, taking that into account, my feelings on this book don't necessarily have any bearing on any opinions I may form on his other books or whether or not I continue to read Brandon Sanderson. He has an enormous catalog, and so my feelings on this book are not an indication of how I proceed with his body of work. And with that in mind, my opinions on this book are not a reflection of me as a person, just as your opinions on a book are not a reflection of you as a person. We are allowed to disagree. People have different tastes, and it's okay. Please do not come for me if we have different opinions on this book. Please. I am just a girl. With the disclaimers out of the way, let's get into it. Elantris was originally published on May 20th, 2006, which makes it practically a classic in the fantasy genre. The story is primarily set in the fantasy city of Kay, which is directly adjacent to the now fallen city of Elantris. Prior to the events of the story, Elantris was a gleaming city of light whose population were these almost godlike creatures who could manipulate magic at will. The walls literally shone, and the citizens of Elantris had gleaming skin and hair and were angelic and benevolent administrators who could create food and water and anything you might need out of nothing. And what is most extraordinary is that to become a citizen of Elantris, to obtain these godlike powers, people from the surrounding area were chosen at random. They would just wake up one day and have the power and have the gleaming skin and hair and be able to go to Elantris and learn the ways of magic. No one knows how or why these people are chosen. It just happened until one day, 10 years before the start of the story, when everything changed. The random selection of citizens was still occurring, but the blessing was now a curse. To be chosen as an Elantrian meant that you were no longer a angelic-like creature with godlike powers. You were actually more like undead. Your skin was gray, your hair fell out, your heart stopped beating, but you were still alive. And any new pain that you experience, you will be feeling forever until you are driven mad. This obviously caused a huge uproar, and the original inhabitants of Elantris were hunted down, and any new person afflicted with this curse were thrown beyond the gates of Elantris to be forgotten about. At the start of the story, the Prince of Kay, the neighboring city on the edges of Elantris, wakes up and learns that he has been cursed, and he is unceremoniously thrown into Elantris. It just so happens that that day, his bride-to-be in a politically arranged marriage is supposed to be arriving for their wedding. Only she learns upon arrival that her intended is dead, but the terms of her marriage contract means that she is still married to him, regardless of whether or not he is still alive. And so she has to stay and has to make the best of her situation. Also at that time, a high priest of a evangelizing religion that seeks to convert the whole world and bring all the nations under the thumb of its empire arrives with orders from on high to convert the city in 3 months, or there will be wanton slaughter. This man is extremely religious, extremely devout, and takes his job very seriously. He believes in his God and his mission. He wants the transition to be nonviolent if possible. And so he arrives with the goal of destabilizing the monarchy and the political stasis in order to more easily convert the city to his God. So those are the 3 perspectives that we primarily see throughout the story. Rauden is the prince of Arelon who was thrown into Elantris, Serene, his bride-to-be, and Hrathen, the priest. The primary conflict seems to be between Serene and Hrathen. Serene does not want to see the city converted because she knows that means that they will become subject to this empire. And that this empire has been responsible for the destruction of other city-states as well, and she very much wants to resist that call. And so since she has to be here anyway because of her marriage contract, despite the fact that she believes her husband to be dead, she decides to take up the mantle of resisting the priest's attempts to convert, while also trying to stabilize the political situation. Her new father-in-law, the king, is pretty much a despot who is very much wealth-driven, and she connects with Rauden, her intended's friends and political circle, to try and figure out the best way to maneuver out from under this despot king, while also resisting the attempts by Hrathen to convert the entire city. Meanwhile, separate from all that, Rauden is just trying to adapt to his new life. His heart no longer beats, his skin no longer heals, and he feels an intense hunger at all times, as do all of the citizens of Elantris. His goal is to make life in Elantris bearable for those who must suffer it. He does this by giving these people purpose, which they very much lacked after being thrown in following their curse. Eventually, these 2 stories come together in an explosive climax that ultimately changes the face of Elantris. And when I was sitting down and thinking about my feelings on this book, they can be summed up in a single word. This book was so boring. Oh my God, it was so boring. The first 50% especially was nothing. It felt like nothing. It gave me nothing. Rauden especially was so extremely bland as a principal character. His motivations were just so surface level and bland. He just was like, well, I'm just gonna be a do-gooder and make sure that everyone has purpose in life, because God forbid if you're not productive, then you're a piece of shit, and that's why you feel shitty all the time. And I found his story arc to be the worst of the 3, extremely boring. I really didn't get why we needed to see so much of what was going on with him, especially. And then you have Serene, who had potential. She entered into this political marriage pretty much on her own. It was her idea because she actually has a pretty good head for politics. But in this world, of course, women aren't thought of as particularly smart or politically savvy. And so her political acumen turns men off. And while I really wanted to like her and I really wanted her to forge that path, the problem was her narration was overly occupied with being what she considered to be unlovable and unattractive. And it was especially frustrating because the only unattractive thing about her was that she was tall. And I'm serious. She was tall and 25, which means she was a spinster. Okay, I know this book was written in 2006, but 2006 is not 1956. That was galling. She is constantly dwelling on the fact that she is going to die alone because the only person she could find who would accept her was this political marriage, and then she showed up and he was dead. So she's trying to outmaneuver this priest and outmaneuver this despot king and do the maximum amount of good that she can in her situation, but she's also just like, I'm so lonely. I just want to feel wanted. I just want to feel accepted. She kept going on about being accepted, about how she was never accepted anywhere. But like her negative features, according to the book, were that she was tall and therefore unattractive, and smart and therefore unattractive, and old, 25, and therefore unattractive. And I just like... Okay, all right. And then you get to Hrathen, who I really didn't like at first. He's the antagonist, so you're kind of not supposed to. But he actually ended up having the most interesting arc about questioning your faith and what faith means. Is it, if you don't feel like religious passion and zeal, do you actually believe? Or can your faith be based on logic, or are those things incongruous with each other? And I am not particularly a fan, typically, of religious trauma-based stories, but he actually ended up having the most interesting arc. He was the only one of the 3 POV characters who experienced growth of any kind. And so while I didn't enjoy him at first because of the religious basis for his arc, it did end up being the most interesting thing in the book, which is so sad because I really wanted to like Serene. I really wanted to like lean into the political maneuverings, but unfortunately, as with what Rowden had going on, it all just felt so surface level. It didn't feel like palace or court intrigue because the intrigue was just very, very basic ideas. I mean, like toddler level. Like, maybe we should treat the peasants like people and not chattel. What? They'll like you more if you do that? Genius! She's a genius. It was extremely like basic. It was almost laughable in how basic it was, yet it was being presented like it was this genius idea and that Serene was like this master political, strategist, when really it was all just very basic stuff. And even Hrathen's political maneuvering to get the population to convert to his religion, his is actually more political than religious. It was very fascinating. He was actually doing things that I thought were clever, still pretty basic, but clever. And then Serene would come up and foil him with an even more basic idea, and he'd be like, oh, she's such a smart opponent. And it's just like, come on, you guys. And between this very surface level kind of plot beats and Rowden's meandering plot that came together at the end, but took a long way to get there, the best I could say is that I was very bored. The first 60% especially was very, very boring and really could have been edited down. As I was getting towards the ending and things were finally starting to be picked up, I was like, okay, I kind of see how everything led up to this moment, but we didn't need nearly as much of it as you think we did. And it's over 600 pages. And I really think we could have gotten at least down to 500 if we had been honest with ourselves. And all of that coupled with the fact that it is dated, very dated. You can feel how dated it is in the way that Serene is described. And there is a very autistic coded character who is magically cured at the end. Didn't love that. And the description of him when Serene first meets him is ableist. And there's a very unfortunate comment that Serene makes about the only character of color. She says something like, if his heart is as dark as his skin, he'll be a strong ally or something. And I was just like, oh, yikes. I literally, in my notes, I wrote, yikes. These are just sort of the things that you could feel are just I don't think they would fly in today's climate. It just made for a reading experience that was not exactly enjoyable or entertaining. And that's really all I have to say about it. I know that I like ranted and raved in my last Behind the Bandwagon book review, but this book honestly just gave me nothing. I was just bored. And the ending did come together in a way that was a little bit exciting, but Serene gets captured at the end in what was probably the most idiotic way possible. And it just reminded me that I only thought that the ending was exciting because of everything that came before it. The ending wasn't better, it was just more interesting, which was not, unfortunately, a very high bar to clear. And unfortunately, that's just all I have to say about it. It was just boring. So I'm going to just briefly go over my cop pile. Characters, I gave a 4. I thought Rowden was extremely boring and had no personality to speak of. Serene started off strong, but her constant preoccupation with the feeling of being unlovable for being tall, could not accept that. And Hrathen was interesting at the end, but point stocked for religious trauma. The atmosphere, I gave a 5. I really liked the concept of this fallen city and what happens after something like that, something so catastrophic happens. But one detail about the fallen Elantris was that it's covered in slime, and it's constantly talked about. Anytime the perspective is in Elantris, it's the slime is mentioned, and I'm just that's gross. And it was kind of pointless. It didn't actually it wasn't a detail that actually needed to be included, and yet we spent a lot of words on talking about the slime. Icky. Gross. Not here for it. Writing, I gave a 5. I have heard some commentary on Brandon Sanderson's early writing that it's not very great, and I didn't really experience that, and that kind of made me wonder, it kind of made me think about how I engage with writing in general. I don't really notice sentence level writing styles. I notice things like a character being preoccupied with being ugly. I notice things like a character having no personality. I don't notice things on a line by line level. I didn't actually find the writing itself to be tedious. It wasn't the best, but it wasn't outright bad. So I gave the writing a 5. I gave the plot a 5. Again, there were little hints of things that could be great, but it was just baby's first court intrigue story, which is why I also gave the intrigue a 3. Logic, I gave a 3. Again, there were just things that didn't make any sense and were not given any sort of explanation either. And my enjoyment, a 5. And when you put that all together, my rating came out to a 2, which I feel is a little harsh because I wasn't hating it. It was definitely a different sort of experience from The Bridge Kingdom, which I also gave a 2. No. In which I was actively disliking the book. I wasn't actively disliking it. I was so bored reading this book. And honestly, I probably would have DNF'd it at the 25% mark if I weren't committed to the bit, which seems to be a running theme here on this channel, is that I am reading books that I know early on I won't like because I've decided I need the content. So to answer the question, does Elantris hold up? Why? You can't even see me. So to answer the question, does Elantris hold up after 19 years? I don't think that it does. Personally. Not just because I am certain that Brandon Sanderson has written far better things in the years since, and not just because I am certain that fantasy has evolved in 19 years. I don't think it holds up because I kind of believe the hype surrounding this book is people going back to it after being exposed to Sanderson's later and better works. That's just my feeling. I don't feel like this was a very strong book at all, and I definitely don't imagine that it is a good representative of Sanderson's larger body of work. I very much doubt I'll find many Sanderson fans who claim this one to be their favorite. And I don't think there's any shame in that. You have to start somewhere. I'm an aspiring writer, and I don't imagine that my book is going to be any better or worse than this effort. I mean, obviously he captured the minds of not just an agent and an editor and a publisher, but fans as well who continue to support him to this day. So it's not a criticism. I just didn't like it. And on that note, that is everything I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I so appreciate it. If you like my content and want to support the channel, please like and subscribe or consider leaving a comment down below. In my next video, I plan to have a tarot card book recommendation for you. I hope you look forward to it, and I will see you then. Bye.